Greetings. Welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. On Wednesdays, we do our wellness checkup, looking into emotional well-being and relationships. So today's vlog is going to be the second half of a vlog that I started last week. In particular, some of you will recall, if you had the opportunity to have a look, at gratitude. So this is gratitude part 2, obviously. I'll leave the link in the description below if you're interested in revisiting or if you haven't seen but might like to take a look at part 1 from last week. Okay, so here's the main question that we're dealing with in terms of the second half. How in the world can we express gratitude or be grateful for our most difficult encounters or circumstances? Okay. So to my mind, there are two broad categories here that would challenge even the most balanced and enlightened souls with respect to how they could manage and cope successfully in a healthy manner. And these basically involve either instances of devastating or inconsolable losses that sometimes people experience, or the issue of where people have been, attacked or abused directly themselves. So I want to consider both of these in turn in relationship to gratitude. So first, imagine that you've just lost your job, or you're been diagnosed with cancer, or perhaps you've lost your home. And then perhaps most devastatingly of all, if you've lost a loved one. How can we be grateful for such things, for such terrible losses? How can we be grateful when we feel like our lives have been turned completely upside down? When we're feeling devastated? In short, how can we express gratitude in the face of unimaginable loss, or when we're experiencing seemingly inconsolable grief? Well, there are many entirely natural emotions associated with grief. Anything that comes with that feeling of our lives being shattered, when we feel like we're broken or something's been taken from us that's irreplaceable. So in such times, sadness, of course, is a natural reaction. It perhaps can't really truly be avoided. Or perhaps numbness or disbelief. Sometimes it's a sense of overwhelming confusion, anxiety, or panic. Or perhaps anger, or again, just simply feeling completely overwhelmed. Simply put, there's a lot to process, and that's normal. And we usually know, or we're reminded by others, that it'll take some time to process what's happened. Or perhaps you're aware of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's seminal book on death and dying, where she outlines the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. There's a great deal of literature and research on bereavement, and in fact, we offer an entire degree in the field of thanatology at my university, King's University College. If anyone's interested in the more academic side or the counseling aspects of death, dying, and bereavement, I should give a shout out to my delightful colleagues. The thanatology faculty, the full-timers, include Eunice Gorman, Darcy Harris, Carrie Trayer, and Lisa McLean. So those are the experts. I'm no expert in the field of grief or grief counseling and so forth, but I did study social work years ago in an earlier life, and having done a year-long placement, among other things, in a nursing home. So I certainly learned a lot about the issues of death and dying in that particular context, and a very much an applied setting. And I'm certainly grateful for that experience, but that's a far cry from dealing with devastating loss in one's own life, and then turning that into gratitude. And yet, that's certainly possible. So it'll take varying amounts of time, depending on who we are and our circumstances, and how we're able to process and interpret the information. we'd have to do a whole other vlog just on the processing of grief, but that's not the main focus today. So the question is, how do we move from grief to gratitude? So gratitude does not and cannot replace grief. It can help us in terms of coping with grief or help us to be more resilient, but I'm not going to pretend that it's realistic or even possible to be grateful all the time. Instead, think of gratitude as a general state of being, an overarching framework within which we situate our lives. The simplest expression would be the idea of being grateful to be alive, to have the opportunity to live and be exposed to everything that life has to offer. If we'd never been born, we'd never have known the happiness or the pain. That's likely small consolation. So let me clarify. We need not be grateful for the specific loss or pain associated with those devastating ruptures or fractures in our lives. There's a real time for tears to flow, to feel the deep sadness or other emotions that help us in response to radical and sometimes completely unexpected changes in our lives. At the same time, we cannot allow ourselves to be consumed by grief or allow that real sense of loss strip away everything about who we still are and what's left behind. For those of us who are grieving are still here. So whatever else has happened in your lives that might be truly remarkable or even unimaginable for some, you are still here. How do I know? Well, you're watching or listening to this vlog. You still exist. And thus, we have some capacity then for both grief and gratitude. Grief involves our own internal sense of processing the pain, a kind of turning inward to manage our emotions, our thoughts in response to profound losses and changes in our lives. Gratitude is sort of the counterpart to that. It allows us to focus on the other-oriented sense of being, to remind ourselves of our connectedness to the past, present, and future, and of course to the others in our lives, including those who have passed on. And it involves really that last stage of grief, acceptance. So in our daily, everyday lives, where we might be perfectly happy in a given moment, content, and so forth, and yet, well, in that sense, we're generally accepting of our conditions and our circumstances. And yet, if we were to stop and think seriously just for a moment, we know that change will inevitably come about, and that will include, in some instances, various kinds of loss. And we might even prepare ourselves for the inevitable through our practices of meditation, prayer, mindfulness, and whatever else we might have been exposed to in our lives. And that includes, of course, practicing gratitude. And that's the main point. I cannot anticipate for a moment the next major loss that I might experience, that you might experience. But you and I can certainly prepare in terms of developing a sense of gratitude in the here and now, and that involves our acceptance of the impermanence of life and the changes that inevitably will occur. And in fact, it's our inability or our failure to expect or to accept change, however unexpected, however shocking that might be, that typically intensifies the pain and the suffering of loss, grief, rejection, and disappointment when change does arrive. Okay? So, one of our greatest challenges then involves learning how to go with the flow in the sense of accepting impermanence. And that includes understanding that the pain we're experiencing in terms of that devastating loss is also impermanent. It's not forever. And we have to remember that. Gratitude has a place in our lives when we recognize that this too shall pass. In fact, the key then becomes, how do we learn how to cope and respond to the passing, to the loss, to the change. And that's where gratitude can be essential or vital in terms of our capacity to cope effectively. The most fundamental form of gratitude, at least in my understanding, would be the gratitude for the privilege of having known someone who has passed, having worked with or lived in a certain place. These can inspire us for the rest of our lives, based on the gifts that they shared, the teachings, the experiences, everything that's etched in our memories, and the positive thoughts and emotions, especially, that are associated with their presence, with their being in our lives. And that's a long-term process. But for me, it always traces back in some fashion or another to a deep sense of gratitude. Okay, so fine, Dr. J. We have to learn how to deal with loss, all of us. But what about the fact that sometimes it's not about loss per se, but what if we experience situations where we're directly attacked or systematically abused, or we live in some type of, highly toxic environment or community or family situation, whatever the case may be? Where's the room for gratitude if we're living with these kinds of circumstances? To be clear, again, there's the immediacy of situations with which we're confronted. And I don't for a moment feel any gratitude, for example, when I'm physically being attacked or violated or abused. In fact, I think I can make a reasonable case that for feeling just about anything else at that particular moment. Perhaps even more important, I believe that if we're attacked directly or threatened directly in a compromising situation, we should take actions that are designed to protect ourselves or our loved ones. We should, to the extent that we're able to, remove ourselves from a dangerous situation. We can deal with the gratitude that we might somehow, seemingly inexplicably, experience later on, but not right at that moment. Even more difficult would be situations that we're exposed to on a regular or even daily basis, especially if we're exposed to truly, abusive individuals or toxic environments. Once more, I would urge anyone in that type of situation to think about themselves first and their safety, and to make necessary changes if possible, right? To remove yourselves or to change those environments in some fashion or another, or where there are unhealthy dynamics that lead to this persistent sense of fear or anxiety or threat, lack of safety, etc. Okay? Now, that said, in some instances, that might even involve having to break off relationships altogether, things that we've traditionally thought we would never end, or relationships with abusive individuals, or toxic environments where at some point you have to say, you know what? This isn't my fault, okay? Nor is it my responsibility to change those who would engage in predatory or destructive behaviors towards us or whomever, okay? It's not our responsibility literally to fix everyone else, or to allow them, for that matter, to keep abusing you just because you have your own personal code of nonviolence or not being the a-hole in a family or a relationship. By the way, one way that I assess toxicity would be if I come to understand that my involvement in a relationship or in a situation, usually it's with a person, but it could be with something at work, or it could be a relationship with an idea for that matter. But my acid test would be, is this relationship turning me into an a-hole, into a person that I don't want to be? Do I find myself turning away from the light? If that's the case, then clearly I need to make a change. And indeed, the other aspect of this is that sometimes it's difficult because the voices in our head are so strong, they're so powerful. Perhaps they've been there all our lives. I spent most of my adult life thinking that I could change certain people or help certain people, even those who continually abused me or put me down, or who literally or implicitly told me you're an idiot or you're worthless. Those were the two most powerful voices that I've been plagued with throughout my own life, and as a result of my own trauma and experiences with PTSD. So how am I supposed to be grateful for such people, or for those traumatic experiences of abuse that did such seemingly irreparable damage? So it's a tough one, I'll grant you that. But here's the key, I think, or one of the keys at least. In a word, it's gratitude's alter ego, empathy. So empathy refers to our understanding, awareness, and sensitivity toward others, including the ability to experience vicariously their feelings and thoughts and their realities. I've always had a deep sense of empathy myself, empathy for others. I could readily identify with their pain. And in fact, I've always tended to attract into my sort of personal and professional sphere, to a certain degree, many people who are struggling with their own pain and trauma. Seem to have a sympathetic shoulder to lean on, or I'll listen actively and empathetically, and people often need that. So, and for that matter, I've always known too that I've been the one who at times has been the cause of others' pain or discomfort. Okay? I can acknowledge that in the past and in certain relationships, I've been the person who has hurt others. And that further reminds me then that I should always strive to be more empathetic and understanding of those around me. But having empathy is no license to allow others to abuse you. We all have to establish healthy boundaries in our relationships. And sometimes those boundaries are quite literal, in the sense that people have to be locked up in some kind of an institution. Why? For their own safety, for the public's safety, at least for a period of time. What empathy does allow us to do then would be to appreciate that others have, and continue to have in some cases, their own struggles. There are almost certainly reasons, identifiable, that help explain why others do what they do. And understanding is not the same as condoning or accepting. Okay? If I learn that someone suffers from paranoid schizophrenia, for example, and they attack me because they're off their meds, it doesn't mean that I just allow them to attack me or accept that, oh, well, that's just the way it is, right? I wouldn't. But I'd use the understanding to express a degree of empathy. And I would tailor my response accordingly. And the long-term process would be to translate empathy ultimately into forgiveness. Certainly forgiveness of yourself, but as well forgiveness towards those who have hurt you. Again, if they're still actively trying to hurt you, okay, then you have to deal with your own safety and your own protection. But with empathy and forgiveness over the longer term, you can place the person, the situation within the broader context that eventually will reconnect you with gratitude, even for those who have deeply hurt you. Okay, so we can find gratitude not in being hurt or being taken advantage of or abused per se. We do not have to express gratitude because people caused us deep pain. I wouldn't be inclined to do so. For example, when I was about 3, I followed one of my big brothers and a couple of his friends up to a school playground. And the boys were all aged 8, 9, 10 years old, something like that. I don't remember exactly. And they had some matches, old-style matches. And they started lighting the matches and flicking them at me. Now, the matches hitting my skin or hitting my body, it hurt a little bit, right? I mean, it was hot. It was a little flame, or it had gone out. So it was a little bit painful from a physical standpoint. But the deeper hurt was their disregard for my own, safety or well-being. And they're making fun of me. right? The bullying aspect. Why would people want to hurt me just because I wanted to come along with them, right? And that was part of the point. They didn't want me around. So this is their way of expressing that. So my response, of course, was to start crying, and I sort of ran home eventually, right? I certainly wasn't feeling any gratitude towards the bullies, one of whom was one of my own brothers. And yet I was eventually grateful, even though I didn't always act accordingly myself growing up or as a young adult. But I knew in my core that that's not how I wanted to treat others. I realized even at a young age that it's no fun being picked on or hurting others. Well, even though I could have hurt others at times or been a jerk in certain particular contexts, I can honestly say, at least from my own standpoint, I've never felt good. I've never enjoyed hurting someone else or causing them pain. And I'm grateful for having learned the lesson that I learned about empathy and hurting others early in life, and then repeatedly over time, sort of reinforced the core learnings. And so, in addition, having been in that position of being vulnerable or being targeted for being different, or in this case, too young, or whatever the status difference was, I started to appreciate anyone else who might be different or feeling excluded for whatever reason or on whatever basis. So, believe it or not, I'm actually grateful for having the pain of being bullied and having been excluded at times or in certain context, not because it, as the bulliers would say, because it toughened me up. That's what the abusers like to tell you, you're making a man out of you, or whatever the case, or this is good for you. That's another classic one. But rather, they provided me with a model, the antithesis of what I wanted to do with my life. In other words, how to live a life filled with putting others down or excluding others to make myself feel special. That's not something I admired or aspired to. Never have. And so in an almost paradoxical way, I'm grateful to those who have hurt me, not so much because they know not what they have done, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but because rather they've illuminated for me the darkness that exists within themselves, potentially within myself. And that ultimately inspired, or has inspired all my life, my quest for understanding the human condition and becoming a behavioral scientist. Sure, if I'd, been happy and, well-adjusted and never had any issues, I might have chosen a different course. I might have chosen to be a physicist, or I might have chosen to be a musician. I don't regret any of those choices. I am who I am, okay? But the point is that I've always enjoyed exploring mysteries of various kinds, and being a behavioral scientist has allowed me to indulge those interests, those passions, and the knowledge that I have in general. So I've quite enjoyed the life that I've chosen to lead. And I didn't know that this would be the pathway forward in my own personal life, professional life. But I don't regret for a moment the fact that I've had this opportunity, that I chose to become a behavioral scientist, and that I've gotten to study and do research and teach and share ideas and experiences with thousands of people that I've encountered over my 4 decades plus spent mostly in the university and in professional life. So I want to wrap up then by expressing my gratitude and ask you to think about what you're grateful for. I'm certainly grateful for the pathways that I've had the privilege of being able to walk, and even for those who have hurt me or abused me as a child. Or all of those folks can indeed take some credit with respect to what I've become, who I've become, what I do for a living. And in fact, they can understand that I do indeed love what I do. I do feel very blessed to be able to do what I do for a living. And so let me end with some more good news, with a more practical focus, so to speak. So believe it or not, all of us are capable of making what I'm calling, in parentheses there, gratitudinal changes. Okay? I'm sure you can see the play on words there. So the research shows that how much gratitude can genuinely help us and facilitate our own well-being. So, for example, there's one study that involved having two groups of individuals. One group who wrote down things that they were grateful for, while another group regularly wrote down things that irritated them on a daily basis. And then after 10 weeks, the grateful group was indeed more optimistic. They felt better about their lives. They exercised more, and they'd had fewer trips to the physician. So that's just a writing exercise, comparing two groups and their approaches to attitude versus focusing on their frustrations and what they were upset about. In another study, couples found that who took the time to express their appreciation and gratitude for their partners felt more positive, not only toward the other person, but also more comfortable about expressing concerns within their relationship. So that's kind of a win-win situation. I can say, again, just personally, my wife and I, we didn't start out this way, but we evolved over time to share expressions of gratitude basically every day at some point, sometimes multiple times each day. We do it quite naturally and effortless, and we reap the benefits of those expressions. So one strategy truly worth pursuing would be to write down or type in your computer 3 things minimum each day for which you're grateful. Use the 3 or 4 rule, whatever you like. It can be about people, it can be about experiences, events, whatever. It just could be about the weather. Make that a daily exercise. And I use that term intentionally, a gratitudinal exercise. Because what's the point of doing any regular exercise? It's to build up, to develop, to strengthen certain kinds of muscles. It doesn't have to be crazy or fanatical. You could do 10 sit-ups or, walk for 15 minutes a day if you're able. And that would help you build up your core strength or your basic cardio, for example. But, there are, as I tell my students, intellectual muscles too, right? So just as if you were training for a marathon, you wouldn't only train, once a week or just the last week before the marathon. You'd want to be training on a regular basis several times per week. And that's true intellectually as well. Right? We have to gradually build up our knowledge, our understanding, our recall, etc., through regular intellectual workouts. Daily stimulation of our brains, again, in whatever format that might take. And then extending that logic further, what would practicing gratitude or engaging in gratitude exercises do for us? Well, that would build up our metaphorical emotional muscles and resilience. Okay? Conversely, what happens to those capacities, to those abilities, or to those types of muscles that we don't stimulate regularly? They atrophy, they wither away, or they never develop in the first place, right? Like the kitten raised in darkness, whose optic nerve doesn't learn how to respond to light properly and so forth. They end up being blind. Right? So we have to invest our energy in the muscles and the abilities that we value, or they will atrophy or succumb to entropy. We literally say in the worst of our moments that we feel like we're falling apart. So in a pinch, you can always try to put a situation into a gratitudinal context, such as being thankful, in a catastrophe or disaster that more people weren't hurt, thankful to the first responders, thankful to the person on the side of the street who lent a hand, thankful that we're still alive, thankful that for what we've learned about the experience, thankful for the chance to make a difference in the future should we be confronted with tragic circumstances or a difficult situation, and so on. And if nothing else, at the more mundane and everyday level, you can just be selfish with your thank yous. What do I mean by that? Well, I personally love expressing to others my thanks and appreciation, even for the small things, because I love seeing their reactions, their smiles, their responses, their happiness. Quite frankly, it makes me happy. Okay? And again, I am truly thankful to have met you online, for your being willing to spend a few minutes, perhaps watching this vlog. If you've chosen as well to be a subscriber, I'm truly thankful. But for now, and on this particular day, I'm especially and profoundly grateful. Why? Because, well, I became a permanent resident to Canada back on August 23rd, 1992, and not seeing any need to really rush into anything. After almost 33 years, about 32 and a half years, I am finally being sworn in as a Canadian citizen on today, February 5th at 10:15 a.m. So presumably that's where I am at 10:15 a.m. I'm online being sworn in for my Canadian citizenship. You see, I waited. I was strategic. I waited until I was old enough that I didn't have to pass the citizenship test, anything like that. They're just giving it to me. So yeah, Canada, it looks like you're going to be stuck with me. I mean, you've had me for 33 years almost, and as a Canadian citizen, I'm happy to continue to pay my taxes and do what I need to do, and hopefully spend the rest of my years, however many I'm granted, right here in Canada. And then I still get to travel to the US and all kinds of other places. So it's pretty cool. So anyway, thanks again for stopping by, to those of you out there in digital TV land, wherever you are. And as ever, I would ask you to, or remind you to continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts. And we'll see you next time.